Rabbi Joshua Garroway is the dean of the Los Angeles campus of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Raised in Rochester, New York, Rabbi Garroway earned his rabbinical ordination from HUC-JIR in 2003, where he also happened to meet his wife, the other Dr. Garroway. He went on to get his PhD from Yale University in 2008. While his academic books and articles focus on the origins of Christianity, and specifically the life and writings of Paul, his teaching and popular writing deal with Jewish texts and history more broadly. But Rabbi Garroway is not just an academic, and he's not just an engaging and thoughtful teacher. He's here tonight because he knows how to bring ancient Jewish texts alive, and he does so in a way that is deeply personal. He can take something that's 2,000 years old and transform it in a way that gets the student to reflect on their own identity and place in the world. As my advisor in rabbinical school, and I believe the only person who had to suffer reading through all 112 pages of my rabbinical thesis, Rabbi Garroway showed me through his example and over regular cups of coffee how to make the word rabbi really mean my teacher. He's completely comfortable bringing his life into his work and his work into his life. I'd be remiss not to mention a few examples of this in the introduction. First, Rabbi Garroway and his wife, the aforementioned other Dr. Garroway, named their oldest child Cyrus because the reign of King Cyrus of Persia marks exactly where her work on biblical studies ends and his work on the Second Temple period begins. As another example, in 2018, when I was the student tasked with gathering donations for an HUCLA silent auction fundraiser, the doctors Garroway offered, I quote, a screening of an ancient-themed movie like Troy or Alexander or Indiana Jones 1 and 3, but definitely not number 2. He's nerdy, he's funny, but he's also real and shows how our history and our identity shape the world that we live in today. For Rabbi Garroway, it doesn't get stuck in an ivory tower. Ancient Judaism can become a part of our hearts and a part of our modern lives. I'm so thrilled that all of you are getting a window into the years of learning that I was lucky enough to have with Rabbi Garroway in Los Angeles, and I hope you'll continue to join us tomorrow morning at Hever Torah at 9 a.m. and at our Lunch and Learn tomorrow, both of which will be wonderful opportunities to learn from Rabbi Garroway as he brings Judaism to life. Rabbi Josh Garroway.
All right, and we're here. I actually was just looking at the part of the Talmud that says why you're not supposed to clap on Shabbat. You're also not allowed to hit your knee, and it's in the same paragraph that talks about how you're not allowed to climb a tree or swim or ride a horse. And they're things that aren't specifically forbidden on Sabbath, but they're not Shabbos-dick. It's a category of work called shvut. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Before I begin my remarks this evening and figure out what my best eye system is, and it's going to be no glasses, I want to express my thanks to the leadership and staff here at Temple Emanu-El, who have made possible my being here. To Rabbi Stern, whom I've admired as a role model for many years now, and Rabbi Lewis, my former student and introducer, and to Rabbi Rosell, who I had not met prior to planning this weekend, and who, unsurprisingly, seems terrific. Thank you, rabbis. Thank you, staff. Thank you all for being here. I suppose I should say thank y'all for being here. I know that doesn't sound right, but I'm trying. I would also like to thank the funders of the Rabbi Olan lectureship. I have to admit to knowing nothing of Rabbi Olan prior to my being asked to speak in his memory, but fortunately, he has a Wikipedia entry. I looked it up and was delighted to learn not only of his inspiring career here in Dallas, but also that we are alike in two important respects. Like me, Rabbi Olan was raised in Rochester, New York. And like me, and here I'm quoting Wikipedia, while in rabbinical school, he heckled teachers and was threatened with expulsion more than once for his attitude. Way to go, Rabbi Olan. That's a man after my own heart, so it's an honor to speak in his memory. One last preamble. I will be speaking from prepared remarks, and once I begin, which hasn't happened yet, I will speak for approximately 22 minutes and 40 seconds. When I asked Rabbi Stern and Rosell how long I should speak, they said about 15 to 20 minutes. As a rabbi myself, I interpreted about somewhat liberally and assumed it meant 22 minutes and 40 seconds. I tell audiences in advance how long I plan to speak so that if you find yourself bored in 5 or 10 minutes, that you can look at your watch and you'll know exactly how long it will be until it's all over. So right now we're looking around the 5, it's all done. So let's delve in. Tonight is not my first Friday night in Dallas. There was a time when I spent nearly every Friday night in Dallas. It was 1983, and I was 7. My Friday nights back then were pretty routine. Dinner at 5:45, off to synagogue at 6:30, race home to catch the Dukes of Hazzard at 8 p.m. on CBS, and then off to bed at 9. But that's when the fun started. Around 9:05, I would slip quietly out of bed, crawl slowly across the hall like a ninja, wend surreptitiously through the crack in my parents' bedroom door, and park unnoticed in front of their bed for 55 minutes of big oil, big egos, big hats, and big everything. Dallas. What a delight. At 10 p.m., I crawled quietly back to my room as I had no interest in those pretentious Californians from Falcon Crest. Now, one week, things went awry. I suppose I'd had too many donut holes at the Oneg, because after the Dukes of Hazzard, I went to bed and crashed. I only remember my mother's remark the next morning at breakfast, "Hey, Josh, we missed you for Dallas last night." Apparently, my parents were not so blissfully unaware as I had thought. And hearing that story, you probably already figured that. Now, from that time on, I stopped sneaking into my parents' room to watch shows at 9 p.m. I just asked, "Hey, Dad, can I sit on your floor tonight and watch The Love Boat? Larry Hagman is a guest star." Things had changed. Now, that's a pretty minor change in a boy's life. The story is not meant to be profound, just endearing and frankly a little silly. But at root, the story does contain an important observation about the way we human beings change over time. From the day we're born to the day we die, there are points along the way, many points, when we are confronted for the first time with realities about the world that challenge what we'd always thought to be true. When we're little, if we're lucky, those revelations tend to be trivial. Well, trivial from the adult perspective, but not from the child's. We learn, for example, that our parents are not so easily duped as we had thought. We learn that the tooth fairy or that Santa Claus isn't real. We learn that professional wrestling is fake. We learn that our grade school teachers have real lives outside of school. I sure remember how traumatic it was when I saw my teacher at the grocery store with a family of her own. And here's the thing. No one ever goes back. No healthy adult, for example, ever goes back to believing in Santa Claus, or to thinking that wrestling is real, or that grade school teachers live in their classroom, or that the Cowboys might one day win another Super Bowl. All right, I said you all. I talked about Dallas and snide remark about the Cowboys. I'm done. Once new knowledge clicks in your mind, you know. And when you know, you know. You can't unknow that sort of thing. And what starts in childhood continues throughout life. Our illusions are constantly being shattered. In adolescence, we come to grips with the fallibility of our parents on a much broader level, or at least so Freud said. And if we were lucky enough to be raised in privilege, one day we come to grips with the fact that the world is not nearly as pristine as we once thought. In adulthood, we confront our own mortality. That first time we wake up and realize we hurt in a part of our body we didn't even know we had. And in that moment, we know we're slowly falling apart. And then eventually, we watch our parents fall apart, often not so slowly. And we know we're next. And you can't unknow that. And love, too, is often described this way. What's more charming than to hear a young couple describe their courtship by saying, "That's when I knew." And when they knew, they couldn't unknow it. So we've all been there. We've all had those moments where we say, "Now I know." And this new, irreversible knowledge changes us and demands that we reorient our minds and our lives accordingly. But it's not just individuals. Groups, too, change in a similar way over time. In the world of science, for example, these collective developments in human knowledge were famously dubbed paradigm shifts by Thomas Kuhn in the early 1960s. Kuhn argued that scientific revolutions occur when enough scientists in a field realize that the established science on which they had long relied has been upended, when an illusion has been shattered because a better way of looking at the world has emerged. My favorite example is the revolution in biology that occurred in the 19th century when the so-called germ theory of disease displaced the medieval assumption that illness results from noxious air in the body called miasmas. That's true. In fact, scientists slowly realized communicable illnesses are caused by little critters that cannot be seen by the naked eye. Most scientists embraced that shift only begrudgingly. I learned recently that President James Garfield succumbed to his gunshot wound in 1881 largely because the doctor in charge of his care, still skeptical of this germ theory, did not sanitize any of his instruments. By now, of course, every doctor subscribes to the germ theory of disease, and it's unimaginable to think that one day we'll return to the old miasma theory of yesteryear. Why? Because once you know, and there's no going back. And this brings me to my proposition for this evening. Judaism, like science, like individuals, Judaism undergoes paradigm shifts. Judaism changes. In fits and starts across 3 millennia, Judaism has changed over and over and over again. And it typically changes when something new becomes known, or in the least, when something new becomes believed, and that new belief simply cannot be unbelieved. Let me give you an example, an obvious one, and one conveniently drawn from this week's Torah portion. This week's portion, Acharei Mot, contains, among other subjects, a description of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, as it was conducted in ancient Israel. To make a long story short, it was a bloodbath. Literally, a bloodbath. The high priest at the temple in Jerusalem would sacrifice a bull, a ram, and a goat, and sprinkle their blood over various parts of the temple bathing the temple in blood. The assumption, it seems, was that the collective sins of the Israelites over the course of the year would pile up inside the temple, rendering it unfit as a home for God on earth. Only by washing it thoroughly in blood once per year could its fitness as God's home be maintained. In the year 70, after about 1,000 years, the temple was destroyed. Responding to a rebellion begun by Jews in the year 66, the Romans, after 4 years of war, breached the walls of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. For Jews, an illusion was shattered. The illusion that their God abides on earth. And shattering that illusion created some pretty big problems. First and foremost, whether the God of the Jews was actually worth worshiping any longer. One of the lesser-known secrets about this period in Jewish history, but one ably described by the historian Seth Schwartz, is that many Jews at this time, perhaps even most, simply abandoned the worship of the Jewish God. They figured that Judaism had run its course, pretty much done. They figured their lives would make more sense if they devoted their worship to Jupiter or Asclepius or Isis or some other god whose house had not just been reduced to smithereens by a human army. But not all Jews. A group of Jews who would eventually come to be known as the rabbis saw the situation differently. The destruction of God's house did not mean for them that God had been demolished or even defeated. Rather, it meant that God had chosen to change the way God interacts with the Jewish people. God would now be accessible through prayer and study rather than sacrifice. And Jewish sins would not be laid up on an altar in Jerusalem, but laid up before God in heaven. And once per year, Jews would pray and repent and afflict themselves so severely that God would see fit to remit their sins. And so the Yom Kippur we recognize today was born. It was born out of the insight of the rabbis, Jews who had shifted paradigms. And the rabbinic Judaism they created marks perhaps the most significant of all the paradigm shifts in the history of Judaism. But nonetheless, it's just one paradigm shift. There are others, many others. And seeing as your rabbis were trained in oratory at the Hebrew Union College just as I was, I assume you know that I plan to offer you a total of 3 examples. 3 corners makes Haman's hat, and 3 corners makes a sermon. We were taught that. Maybe the older guys, the young people, we're not sure what they're learning nowadays. So what's the second example? Well, the second example, you're looking at it. It's me. It's us. It's this common enterprise that we call Reform Judaism. Our movement originated 2 centuries ago in Western Europe, when French and German Jews were thrust into a new reality. The conquests of Napoleon sprung Jews from the European ghetto, where for nearly a millennium, cordoned off from society, they had clung resolutely to medieval Jewish practices and ideas. Once emancipated from the ghetto, these Jews strove for admission into modern society, and they embraced the ideals of modern enlightenment. Ideas like egalitarianism, universalism, rationalism, science. And gazing back from this new purchase, these Jews looked upon the Judaism of the past as antiquated and obsolete. They saw in medieval Judaism a religion that chauvinistically separated Jews from non-Jews, male Jews from female Jews. They saw in medieval Judaism a religion that, in their view, obsessed over unimportant ceremonial observances, a religion that clung to outmoded, disproven ideas like Moses had written the Torah word for word, or that prayers to God is what makes it rain. Now, one of the lesser-known secrets about this period in Jewish history, but one ably described by the historian and my teacher, Michael Meyer, is that many Western European Jews at this time, perhaps even most, simply abandoned Judaism. They figured that Judaism was pretty much done. It had run its course. So they stopped going to synagogues, stopped observing Jewish rites, and in many cases, they converted to Christianity. Not necessarily because they believed in it, but because, hey, if you're not going to be Jewish, why not fit in? But not all Jews. Certainly not Orthodox Jews who clung to medieval Judaism as though nothing had changed. But also not the creators of our movement, who set about to reconfigure Judaism yet again, to reform Judaism, to make Judaism modern and more universalistic and more rational, a Judaism that would make sense to modern, emancipated, enlightened Jews. And we are their heirs. And we're still reconfiguring. Heck, I suspect we'll still be reconfiguring Judaism according to modern sensibilities when the next paradigm shift occurs, whenever and whatever that turns out to be. But one thing is for certain about this reconfigured Judaism we call reform. We're not going back. We're not going back to a medieval, non-universalistic, non-rational, non-egalitarian Judaism. Why? Because Reformed Jews simply can't unknow or unbelieve what we now know and believe. We've shifted paradigms. So the third example. This one might surprise you. It also might irritate you, but irritation is good for learning. I'm thinking of your neighbors down the road. Now, I don't know who's down the road, but seeing as this is Texas, I'm guessing there's a church down the road. I'm guessing there's 10 churches down the road. Now, Christianity, I understand to be a historical paradigm shift in Judaism. Christianity began in the middle of the first century when a group of Jewish men and women came to believe that God had raised their teacher from the dead. Do I believe their teacher had been raised from the dead? No. But do I believe that Kephas and Yaakov and Yochanan, who'd later become known as St. Peter and St. James and St. John, did they believe their teacher had been raised from the dead? Yeah. Christianity is not a hoax. Peter, James, and John, and later Paul and countless other Jews, genuinely believed that God had raised their teacher, Jesus, from the dead. Now, experiencing your teacher raised from the dead is not something you can just unknow. It's not something you can just ignore. You can't wake up 2 days later and be like, yeah, remember when that guy was raised from the dead? Well, moving on. If the Jewish God had raised your Jewish teacher from the dead, surely there must be some Jewish reason why. And to make a very long story very short, the reason that was ultimately developed by the disciples to account for the resurrection of Jesus became Christianity. And you know its basic contours. I hope she's not upset that I said Santa Claus is not real. I feel really bad about that. Tooth fairy she can deal with, but I don't know. Okay. You know the basic contours of Christianity. Jesus was raised from the dead, they said, because he was God's Messiah. God's Messiah, they said, had to suffer and die ignominiously on a cross to atone vicariously for the sins of the world. And incidentally, if you're wondering why they might think a Messiah might have to do such a thing, You'll want to come to my lunch and learn tomorrow when I consider that very question. And sinners, they said, whether Jewish or non-Jewish sinners can escape sin and the terrible punishment it brings only by dying and becoming reborn through baptism into the death and resurrection of Jesus. And lastly, the Jewish scriptures, they said, the Torah and the prophets. They foresaw this whole eventuality all along through the utterances of its prophets Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others. Now, eventually, of course, the paradigm shift created by this answer led to the emergence of a community that no longer saw itself as a part of Judaism, and indeed defined itself over and against Judaism. Sometimes that happens when paradigms shift. And incidentally, if you'd like to learn more about that, you might come to my learning session tomorrow morning. Now, as you can tell, I view Christianity somewhat more sympathetically than many other Jews. Not because I think it's right. Jesus was not raised from the dead. Jesus has not returned, nor do I think God deals with sin through sacrifice, animal, human, or otherwise. But I am nonetheless fascinated by the earliest Christians because of their honesty and their conviction and their ingenious reconfiguration of Judaism's texts and traditions to account for a new reality that they could not unknow. Why? Because frankly, it's that same honesty, that same conviction, that same ingenuity, and that same pluck that inspired our forerunners in the Reform movement to demand that medieval Judaism be reconfigured to accord with the ideals and the truths revealed by the Enlightenment. And in their case, I think they were right, which is why I am a Reform Jew. So before I close, and those of you who have been looking at your watches see that we are getting very close to the 5, I'd like to address briefly the one question I am invariably asked whenever I offer a lecture such as this on paradigm shifts in Jewish history. If the paradigm shift called Christianity ultimately became a religion different from and even opposed to medieval Orthodox Judaism, am I suggesting that our Reform Judaism might one day become a religious community different from and even opposed to the medieval Orthodox Judaism from which it sprang? My answer? Maybe. I don't know what the course of Judaism will be over the next few centuries. I don't know what will come of Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, Christianity in all its guises. As a historian, I often say that it's hard enough trying to figure out what happened in the past. I'm not venturing to guess what will happen in the future, unless it's about horses running around in a circle or a certain football team not winning the Super Bowl next year. On that, I'll place a bet. But I'll conclude by reiterating what I've already said. We Reform Jews cannot unknow the Enlightenment. Our Judaism moving forward will always be informed by that new paradigm, at least until the next paradigm comes along. And if such an enlightened Judaism eventually becomes so incompatible with its predecessor that a clean break is in order, so be it. But until that day, I can only hope that we Reform Jews will do our darndest to bring Judaism in all its fascinating manifestations as close as possible to the truth as we know it and cannot unknow it. Shabbat Shalom.